Message is going to be taken from John chapter 4, the story, of course, of the Samaritan woman at the well. And we've talked about her quite a bit and how the Samaritans were the misfits, the low lives, free Jews, and worshiping wrongly from the days of Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom, and how Jesus came in and gave a second chance at redemption. And it's a beautiful thing at the second shot of redemption when your life is going in turmoil, and yet there's a Lord who sees through it all and offers you a redemption from all of it. There's nothing like that. My heart aches when I see people falling into other religions that they think are going to help them in some way, but cannot speak to the issues that they need most. It cannot speak to their soul. It cannot speak to their eternity. It cannot even speak to the depths of what they need in their present situation. It cannot give them ultimate peace. It cannot give them ultimate joy. It cannot give them ultimate satisfaction. It can't give them any of these things, and yet they're seeking them. And there's so little time they have on this life before their life is over. And then they come up empty and have to stand before the Lord of eternity and have nothing to offer him. That's so sad, so sad. And you've got to be able to see that and see the picture. I think that's why the Lord impressed upon me at a young age, you've got to find truth and you don't have much time. And really, you really don't. You have to navigate through this and get settled quickly, and you have to move in and that type of thing. You know, and so when we see this woman, we see a shot of redemption. We see the fact that she was married 5 times and was living in a relationship with a man on the 6th time. She didn't start out that way, and people don't, but she represents many people. She represents people who have tried to find satisfaction in life their way, and it hasn't worked out. And now you're older, and you don't have any prospects of things getting better. And yet the Lord saw her, found her, and came to her at his own expense. I like the way it says in John chapter 4, verse 4, that it says he must needs go through Samaria. And when you see where the Lord came from out of Judea to go to Samaria, that was quite a trip. It's a long area to go. It's a long journey. And that only underscores the fact that he needed to be there. He had to leave at a certain time in order to arrive there by noon. It was around noon when he got there. He sat upon the well, which was an old well from Jacob. And Jacob's well was there, and that's when he knew the woman would be coming out to draw water. Jesus teaches us a tremendous amount in terms of being fishers of men. First of all, you learn their habits. You learn where they are. You meet them where they are. You don't ask them to come to you. You have to find them. And when you find them, you address them. But how do you address them? Do you address them from a patronizing sense? Do you address them as being over them and they being lesser than you? No. Jesus simply asked the woman, give me water to drink. And the woman is going to give him water. But there was a question in her mind. Why would a Jew be talking to her? Because the Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. Immediately you understand the history that the Jews considered themselves superior, and they considered the Samaritans inferior. And everything was done from that standpoint. In fact, the Jews made no bones about the fact that they never even wanted to see a Samaritan, let alone have to address one. Even as an inferior, they hated them. They looked down upon them. And so Jesus talking to the woman and talking to her on an equal level and talking to her in a non-demeaning way, but a good way, an affirming way, asking something from her, needing her for something for him, is something that really struck this woman as unusual. Simple things that just go counter to the way culture goes. If you're looking, you can see it. If you have the heart, you can fit into those cracks, because there are lots of cracks. There are lots of these areas where people just don't do the right thing because they don't consider you worthy of it. They don't consider it worth their time. You know, oftentimes, I remember when I was young and ministers used to call me, what can I do, you know? And I'm saying, hey, they're sinners, they're people that are older, they're nursing homes, they're places you can go, you know, if you don't have the pride of having to be up in Sunday church on Sunday morning and have people ooh and ah over your great, magnificent sermon, they're always places to serve. They don't bring remuneration. They don't necessarily bring the TV and the newspaper articles, but they're places to serve. And if you look, you can see them. They're all over the place. You see, you learn to see them, and this is part of what I want to emphasize in this story. We know the story of this woman where Jesus addressed her. He had a conversation with her that he turned to not physical water, but living water. They were already talking about water because he needed a drink, but living water was what he expressed to her. At first, she thought, of course, he was talking about real water, in other words, physical water. But that's not what he was talking about. He said, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that's asking you, you would have asked and he would have given you living water. In other words, Jesus knew the woman's heart would make the right choice if given the right question. And that's very rare because most people in life will not always make the right choice for the gospel. And yet, this woman, with all of her failures, would make that choice if offered. And so the woman said, the well is deep. Where are you going to get this from? What are you talking about? Jesus said, whoever drinks of this water shall thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I give him will never thirst. But it'll be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. That is satisfaction. She's always been looking for satisfaction, an eternal satisfaction. Now, really, most people are looking for it, but everybody doesn't have the humility or the desire to accept it if it's coming from God directly. They think they can find it their way. They think they can find it through the flesh. They think they can find it through their own self-efforts. And really what is being offered is beyond that. You will have to labor to maintain what you do, but God is the one who's going to make it work for you. And so when he was offering that water, she said, sir, give me this water that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. Isn't that interesting? Give me that water that I thirst not. Interesting, she's the one who comes to draw water, but she also comes to drink water. The same person that has to give you water has to drink themselves. And if you watch in life, that's the way it is. The same person who serves you food at a restaurant has to eat themselves. The same person that takes care of your child has to go back and take care of their own. The same person who carries your luggage is the same person who has to pack their own when they go somewhere. In other words, there's nothing you do in service that you don't need service yourself. That's the way this life is. Everybody has the same needs. But seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and its righteousness, all things shall be added. And so Jesus asked her a question that seems to be unrelated to the living water. He says, go and call your husband and come here. She says, I have no husband. Now that seems like a simple answer, but that's a very difficult answer to give. They don't want to admit that what they've done in life has not brought about what they've wanted it to bring about. People will talk about their problems, but they still have a certain pride that they don't want to say, hey, I have failed. And when this woman says, I have no husband, she was admitting my life has been a zero because she's always wanted a relationship that lasted. She didn't intend on having 5 husbands. She didn't intend on having relations with a 6th. That was not the way this set out. This is not the way this was supposed to go. But that's the way it is. And so she came clean to a man she didn't really know. And she admitted, I have no husband. If people would come to the Lord when the Lord comes to them and they would say, I have no righteousness. If they would come and say, I have no life. If they would come and say, I'm just wrong and I need change, then the Lord could heal them. But they usually don't come like that. They usually come hiding the fact that they're really empty. They usually come acting as though they have something to offer that they really don't. They usually come trying to impress you because thinking that impressing you will oftentimes give validity to their own existence. And they don't come clean. This woman came clean, and it took a lot to do that. But that demonstrated something about her that the Lord is seeking from every one of us. Humility, honesty. Just say it. I was wrong. And when people do things and they invest themselves in wrong, they're less likely to say that. They just keep badgering why they think you should understand they're right. But they don't just come out and say, I'm wrong. You have to lower yourself. You have to just leave it the way it is. People are always talking about honesty, but honesty in terms of eternity is very rare, where people just admit, my life is not right. I can't get it right, and it's not going right. I have failed. I have failed. And Jesus said, hey, you speak the truth. You've had 5 husbands. Now the one you're living with is not your husband. You're speaking the truth. Now the woman knows, he knows stuff about her that, how did he know this? He must be a prophet. So then she goes back into the history. The Samaritan people are always considered the worst. They didn't worship in Jerusalem. Jeroboam, many centuries earlier, had them worshiping up in the mountains and in the hills because he didn't want them to go into Jerusalem because he wanted himself to remain king. So he set up a false religious system for them for over 700 years. And they've been following that. And she knows that the Jews are against that. The Jews in the South says you have to worship the law of Moses. You have to come to the temple. You have to worship according to the way prescribed in Holy Writ. And that was true, but what was not true was that they were looking down on everyone, thinking they had no life. And now Jesus is coming to her, and she says, you say in Jerusalem is the place we ought to worship. And this is when Jesus says, listen, God is spirit. The time is coming, and now is when the true worshipers shall worship him in spirit and in truth. God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. There is nothing like having to worship God in spirit and in truth. With God, you have to make it all bare. With God, you have to come clean. With God, you have to come in low. You can't come in high-hitting. You have to come in low. You have to come in under the radar. You have to come in and leave everything at the door. You got to check your pride. You got to check your ego. You got to check the way you're thinking. You got to trust him above all of that and come in and say, Lord, here I am. Take me the way I am. I trust who you are. Now, to say it is one thing, to come that way is another. And this woman was willing to come that way. There was no miracle given. There was no supernatural wonder given. It was simply a conversation. But this woman was ready. She dropped her water pot in verse 29, and she ran into the town, and she cried out to all of the men there, saying, come see a man, which told me all things ever I did. Is not this the Christ? What I find amazing about this is people try to hide what they've done, not try to expose what they've done. It's not very flattering for a person to tell you about the life that you've had that didn't add up to much. Usually that's what you try to cover. But this woman is saying it in an open way. He told me all things. In other words, I can be perfectly honest and show him all of my errors, and he still loves me. He still came to give me living water. This must be the Christ, because only the Christ will do that. No other person in this earth and no other religion is going to love you, having offended God all the times we have, and still come and offer you living water and personally make it his business to get to you. Is not this the Christ? Such a stir it caused that the men came out to see him. They came out to see him. They heard him, and then they begged him to stay with them, and he stayed with them for 2 days. All of this transpired in a 2-day period. Isn't that amazing? Some people come to church for years and never get saved. But in 2 days, these Samaritans came out and they heard him and they said, now we believe you. We know you're the Son of God, not because of what the woman says, but we've heard you ourselves and we're convinced. But it was the woman that got them to come. All of those who are working in the field are part of the laborers in the kingdom. Jesus was very concerned. He said, the harvest is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray ye the Lord of the harvest that he would send forth laborers into the harvest. There are lots of people who want to go in to get the wages. There are lots of people who want to go in and capitalize on the fringe benefits. There are lots of people who are wanting to go in if there's something in it that's going to really trickle down and help them. But the laborers are the ones who are not looking for that. They're going into work. And if you know anything about harvest time is a time that you have to do it at a certain time. You can't just go and harvest any old time you want. You have to harvest when it's ready. All hands have to be on deck. You have to work hard. You have to work smart. You have to work efficiently. And you have to do it right. And you have to pull and labor in the vineyard, just like you do in the field. You can't just go and harvest whenever you want. You have to wait until it's ready. And then when it's ready, you've got to be ready. If you're not ready when it's ready, you're going to lose your harvest and you're not going to eat that year. So harvest time is important. Jesus is making the gospel an analogy to harvest time. And then he goes on to say, behold the fields, lift up your eyes and look upon the harvest, for it is ripe, ready to harvest. His disciples had gone to buy food. They came in from the field. And they were saying they wanted him to eat. And he says, I have meat to eat that you don't know about. I have food to eat that you don't know about. And they said, is anybody giving him food to eat? And he was talking about doing the work. It gave him pleasure. It gave him energy. It gave him meaning. It gave him life to give others life. He said, don't say they're 6 months or 4 months and then comes the harvest. Lift up your eyes, look upon the fields, they're white, all ready to harvest. In other words, there are fields around the world, but they're not field hands. There are places to harvest everywhere. They're right in front of you, but you've got to be able to see them. You've got to be able to see them. You know, a good floor general in basketball is very coveted because a good person who knows how to bring the ball up and they can see the court is somebody that every coach wants to coach. Some people have a natural ability to see things other people don't see. They can come down the court and they can see the person who's open that everybody's forgotten about. They can come down the court and they can set up a play and know where everybody's to fit on the court. And they know how to be able to get the ball to them at the certain spot at the certain time that other people are not aware of. In football, a quarterback that is very good at looking at the field is highly coveted. A quarterback has to take the few seconds they have to hold off that incoming line to be able to see their secondary, to be able to see the linebackers, to be able to make a play and to try to see the weaknesses in the defense to get somebody through. And a little second can make all the difference in 1 yard or 10 yards. You have to be able to see it. You see, people that can see what's there in front of them are people that coaches love to coach, because they can see the things that other people can't see, and they know how to set things up. They're like floor generals. Well, what God is saying is you've got to be a missionary general. You've got to be able to see what other people don't see. You see, the Samaritans were invisible. People didn't like them, therefore they didn't deal with them. They went about ministering, but they didn't go about seeing people that are right there that can be ministered to, that were more ready for the gospel than they were prepared to give the gospel. And this is oftentimes the way it is. Pray the Lord. When he says send laborers into the harvest, you've got to send the laborers who have to pray for the vision to see it. There are people right in front of you, but if your heart doesn't care for them, you're not going to help them. It's like the man who walked by the man who was half dead. The priest walked by and saw him and walked by on the other side. The Levite was there, walked by on the other side. But the Samaritan had compassion. They could see it, but they didn't care. He saw it and cared, even though he didn't know the man. The compassion motivated his vision. And sometimes people have natural vision. But when you have the vision of God, you've got to see and care. You've got to be able to care. If you care, God will open your eyes to see. But if you don't care, it doesn't matter what you see. You don't really see because you're blind. That's what he was saying. If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say you see, therefore your sin remains. John 9:39 and 40 through 41. The point of the matter is, God is guiding us, but we've got to see. When you have prejudices, when you're looking down upon people, you're never going to witness to them. And what witness you do give is going to be a horrible one, because you're certainly sending out the message you don't care. You know, you look at Christians in politics and you look at the Christian right and all of these. But when they're talking about the left so denigratingly, you lose the ability to ever witness to one. You don't think of that. You're looking at all the evils and you're looking at all the wrong, but you don't consider all of that talk and vitriol is setting you up for people not to trust that you care. And as a Christian, that should concern anyone. Whenever you're with a person who is lost, If you don't care, you can never reach them. So when you send out the message, you don't care, and then you wonder why they're not doing right by God, and you don't see yourself complicit in the process, there's a problem. You don't have good vision, or you don't have a good heart, or both. But something is wrong, and that's where we're standing here. You have to be very careful about that. How do you stand up when you've already given people a bad name about how you think of them? When they know they hate you, or when they know you hate them, it's going to be hard to reach a person, to convince them that you don't hate them when all they see is that you do. That's going to make the road very hard. You don't want to go against your own harvest, do you? You don't want to say it's harvest time, let's put in some tares. You don't want to make things more difficult on you. It's already enough labor to get all of the crop in, and you're wanting to get it while it's ready, because once it's over, it's over. You can't go back and redo harvest. You have to do it at the time that it's ready. The same with the gospel. In the day you hear my voice, Jesus says, harden not your heart. You've got to do it at a certain time. And also he says, I'm sending you to reap wherein you bestow no labor. Other men have labored and you're entered into their labors. What he's saying is everyone has part in the laboring process who labors in the kingdom. There's some people you can come to and offer the gospel and they accept it. But that's not the first time they heard it. They may have heard it 20 times by their grandmother and rejected it. And you're the one time they heard it and they put all that together and all of that worked to their salvation. You're standing on the shoulders of people before you, just like other people to come are going to be standing on your shoulders. You owe them. You see, when you look at the history of the situation, all the way back to Adam, who lived 930 years. Then he had a son, Seth, who replaced Abel, that lived 912 years. He had a son by the name of Enos, who lived 905 years. And then Canaan, 910 years. Mahalalel, 895. Jared, 962. And then Enoch, 365. And then there was Methuselah, 969, and Lamech, 777 years. Then there was Noah, who lived 950 years. Now, I don't have none of that time, but I do have the time God has given me. And that time, if you're looking, still is harvest time. You go on after that, and then Noah, after living 950 years, his sons lived. And then Shem and Arphaxad and Salah and Eber and Peleg and Reu and Serug and Nahor and Terah and Abram. And then all of those, and the Abrahamic promise was given to him. And then the Abrahamic promise was about a huge field. Your seed would be as the stars of heaven, as the sand which is by the seashore. If you can count the stars, if you can count the sand, God says that's how your seed's going to be. Whoa, can't beat that one. And then Abraham had Isaac. And then God said, you offer him up as a burnt offering. But he had also said, in Isaac shall your seed be called. Why would God destroy the very person upon whom all those promises are kept? But Abraham trusted God. He trusted him so much that even though he didn't understand why God was telling him to kill him, he knew that God couldn't lie. If God said the seed was going to be great, that had to come to pass in spite of the fact that he killed his son. If he killed his son, maybe God will raise him up. Whatever God's got to do, he's going to do it, but God cannot lie. In order to be a good laborer into the vineyard, you have to believe that God doesn't lie. You also have to trust in his vision above yours. And then after that, Isaac grew up. He had twin sons, Esau and Jacob. And Jacob was the trickster, but Jacob loved the right things. And Jacob ended up getting the birthright and the promise. And he carried on, and he had 12 sons. 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. And then Jacob said before he died, in Judah will your seed be called. But it was the third son, Levi, that takes a detour, because Levi had several sons: Gershom, Kohath, and Merari. And out of the Kohathites came Moses and his brother Aaron and sister. You see, the Kohathites had a child, and then it came down to his two parents, and we know who they were: Amram and Jochebed. Jochebed was his mama's name. Amram was his daddy's name. And that was the great deliverer who delivered his people from Egypt. But it was the fourth son, Judah, through whom the Messiah would come. And it would come through strange circumstances. He actually had sex with his daughter-in-law, but he didn't know that was her. She pretended to be a prostitute, and in those days they covered their faces, so you never saw their faces. And when his wife had died, he was looking for some type of comfort and went into this prostitute along the way. And she did it because he was supposed to give her his youngest son. But he detained doing it because he was afraid God would kill him, like he had killed his other sons. And he went into her, and he had sex with her, and she ended up getting pregnant with twins. When he found out she was pregnant, he thought she was a prostitute, and he said, "Bring her forth to be burned." But she showed the man's bracelet and staff who had impregnated her, and he knew it was him. And he said, "She's been more righteous than I." Had he killed her and had all of this done, it would have broken things. But she had two children, twins, Zerah and Phares. You got to get the beauty in this. Zerah came out first, and the midwife knew they were twins, so she put a little ribbon around his hand when he came out to mark. He's the firstborn. But before he could come out, his brother came out over him, jumped over his brother and came out. His name was Phares, which means breach. She says, "How is this breach broken forth?" It was Phares. He had a son by the name of Ezra, who had a Ram, who had a Aminadab, who had Nahshon, who had Salmon. Salmon ended up marrying Rahab the harlot, having a son by the name of Boaz, who ended up marrying Ruth the Moabitess. And they had a child by the name of Obed, who ended up having a child by the name of Jesse, who had several sons, the youngest of whom was David, the king. You got to see the beauty in all this. You can't see it from this side because you got all this dysfunction going on, but God is still moving. That's why you have to have the vision of a harvest person. If you look at it from the way the world looks at it, you won't see anything. But if you look at it the way God is telling you to look at it, you'll be able to see things and do things you never thought possible. As you begin to see it fold out, after all of this was happening, with Boaz and Jesse and David, David became the king in Israel, by whom all good kings were measured. David had a son by the name of Solomon, who took over the throne, who had a son by the name of Rehoboam, who had Abijam, who had Asa, who had Jehoshaphat, who had Joram. Joram had a son by the name of Ahaziah. Ahaziah had a son by the name of Joash, who had Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, Manasseh, Amon, and then there was good King Josiah. Josiah had Jeconiah and his brothers. It was the time of the Babylonian captivity. I don't care which scholar you take. It comes down to 587 to 586 BC, the final deportation, where the Jews were taken away from their country down into Babylonian captivity. Ezekiel was taken down in one deportation. Daniel was taken down in another deportation. But they remember Jeremiah. He was the prophet man in Jerusalem. And they were down there for all of those years. 70 years, God says, before you can return. And it was 70 years before the Persians took over and allowed them to return. Persians never had a clue that they were called to do what God had prophesied on his own timetable. But that's exactly what happened. The Persians allowed them to come up. They started to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. These were the days of Ezra and Nehemiah and Haggai and all of those prophets. It was the days of Zechariah and finally Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, around 450 BC. All of these things were happening. And then after the Persians, Alexander the Great took over. He took over and he conquered the Persian Empire, and he made it all a Greek city-state. And he made Greek the official business language over all the world, just like English is today. Everybody spoke Greek. It didn't matter what you spoke in your house. When you got out in the common places, no matter what the languages were, everybody could communicate in Greek. He didn't know at the time, but by putting everything into Greek, he also aided in the spreading of the gospel, because now the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek and became what is called the Septuagint. That's when 70 to 72 elders went down to Alexandria, Egypt, and translated it. Now the Bible could be read by the common person. Now it's spreading it. You see, the world doesn't know what it's doing for the gospel, and they don't know what God is doing for them to get his will done in the midst of them at the same time. And after the Greek Empire, there was the Roman Empire, Pompey in 63 BC. Julius Caesar, and then Augustus Caesar, and then Tiberius Caesar, under which Jesus basically reigned. And then it was after that where you had the others, Gaius Caligula, Little Boots, they used to call him. All of these others that came up afterwards. But our Lord was born during that time. And our Lord lived about 30 to 33 years. We know this for sure. All you have to do is follow John's gospel and the Jewish feast. And then you come up with the fact that he called 12 men. He called 12 men. Peter, then his brother Andrew. Then there was also James and John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon Zelotes, Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, or the other way around, Simon the Canaanite, Judas Iscariot. He gave them power against devils to cast them out and to heal all manner of people. He went about doing good and healing all that were vexed of the devil. Then he set up, not only that, the apostles set up others, and they started elders in the churches and all of that type of thing. And all of that was being spread and spread. They started in Jerusalem, went to Samaria, Judea, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. They started spreading up into what is now Europe. They went into that area and they started spreading the gospel. We know the Apostle Paul was born in what is modern-day Turkey, on the border of Syria and Turkey, and he began to spread the gospel. We know that Thomas, one of the 12 disciples, went over to India and started spreading the gospel there. It is well reported that the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8 went down to Ethiopia and started spreading the gospel in Africa. All of a sudden, this gospel is starting to move all over the earth. And by it being spread in Europe, the Americas came along much later, and they were one of the sons of the European, and they brought it with them. They brought a whole lot of other stuff too, but they brought that with them. And they also took slaves from the African continent, among whom were some of my ancestors. I don't know who they were. I don't know which part they came from, but I stand on their shoulders because they're the survivors that went through those slave ships, and they made it all the way to the end. They settled down in the North Carolina area, because I know where my daddy and my mama come from. And there were a lot of slaves named Ledbetter in that area. I can't trace which ones belong, but I know I belong and come from one of them. And during that time, we stand here. Now, in my lifetime, and I don't know how long it is, I've got very little time. But what I'm trying to say is, one sows and another reaps. You've labored, and God has sent you in not to labor. You're laboring on other men's labors. In other words, I'm laboring on something somebody did before me. Somebody did before them. Somebody did before them. Somebody did before them. It's very important to take the baton and go on with it and not go backwards. And what I'm saying is, this is what he's talking about here. One sows and another reap. I sent you to sow wherein you bestow no labor. Other men are labored, and you're entered into those labors. I stand on the shoulders of many slaves. I stand on the shoulders of people who have come to know Christ. I stand on the shoulders of all of the apostles. I stand on the shoulders of Jesus Christ himself. I stand on the shoulders of the law and the prophets that announced him and witnessed his coming. I stand on the shoulders of all of those. And I don't know what part you have to play along with what other people have played. But I do know that if you labor, you'll all be partakers of the same harvest. And that's his point. The harvest is bigger than you think, but everybody gets paid at the end of the day. And let me tell you something. God doesn't take your taxes out. The pay is going to be quite great, but you got to labor. And in order to labor, I can't be deterred. The harvest is bigger than black people, white people, yellow people. It's bigger than that. It's bigger than other religions. You've got to preach the gospel, which is definite, but you've got to be able to see other people to get it to that are preaching and living indefinitely. And if you don't see the vision, you can't be much help to the coach. And Jesus is the coach. He's the one putting you in the game. How quickly can you see things? How can you see this person open? You see, sometimes there's somebody open, you just don't want to pass them the ball. And sometimes you better pass them the ball because they are the only ones open. And you've got to know the difference. You've got to have confidence in God and what he's doing. What he's doing. I always remember the story of this kid. He couldn't play ball, but he was on the football team, but he rode the bench all the time. And he wanted to get in the game. So he badly wanted to get into the game, but now they're in their last game of the season, and it was an important game. The coach didn't want to put him in. But for some reason, this kid who really couldn't play well, he kept begging the coach, "Coach, put me in. You got to put me into the game." So he just bugged, and they were having problems and everything. So the coach finally put the kid into the game. And the kid went crazy. He was scoring left and right. He was dodging touchdowns. He was doing all this kind of stuff. He was playing like he was some All-American and everything. Come to find out, they finally win the game. The Coach couldn't believe it. He said, "What got into you?" He said, "My dad was blind, and he died the other day, and this is the first time he could see me play." You're playing for Jesus. You're playing for the God of the universe. And you got one shot. And you don't know how long that shot is. But you got to know how to read the field. And you've got to know what your master would want you to do. There's no time to be prejudiced. There's no time to be bigoted. You got to get your heart right if you're going to labor in this field. And if your heart's not right, you're not in it. Just like if your talent's not right, you're not in the game. If you don't have the right savvy to know what to do, if you don't have the right patience to know when to hold it and just go crazy, then the coach doesn't have confidence in you in that game. And you got to know your master well enough to navigate around all these things that people get stuck in. Because the harvest is bigger. All types of people out there you would never think would come to the gospel that you never even talk about or think about. And sometimes you see them every day, but it never crosses your mind. They're the biggest field. You got to look at the field. Jesus said, "Lift up your eyes. Lift up your eyes. See the field. It's open to harvest." We were reading this morning in James 2, not having the Lord's faith of the Lord with respect to persons. And I read a segment of Jeremiah Asher. He was a black man, called Negroes in those days if things went well. And this was around in the 1850s before the Emancipation Proclamation. And he was living in the North, which was not a slave area, but there was still lots of discrimination and segregation. And he was attending a white church, and they had what he called the Negro pew. And it was in Baptist churches, it was in many churches. And so the Negro pew was set in the far parts of the church, and it was only for Negroes to sit in, and it fit about 15 to 20 of them. And usually the sides, he said, were so high you couldn't see anything. For all practical purposes, couldn't see the preacher, couldn't see much of anybody else, and I'm sure it was designed that way. And one day he got there late, so he didn't even get into his regular spot on the Negro pew. And so when he did that, he decided, forget it, I'm leaving. So he left that church for a while, went to another place, and the members of the church hadn't heard from him, so they didn't know why he left. And so eventually he told nobody about it, except he ran into the deacons, and he told a couple of deacons. Well, they told the church was really concerned because they wanted the Negroes to come back. But now they presented themselves with the dilemma. We want the Negroes to come back, so the church asked, what would satisfy the Negroes? Because they're getting quite out of their place. That's a quote. And Jeremiah Asher said, we're not getting out of our place. We're not asking for anything, because he mentioned in the church there were a lot of empty seats anyway. So it's not like the church was so packed out that they would take up anything. But even in the gallery, which was up and outside of the regular main part of the church sanctuary, you could have sat. But they're going through all this process and getting ready to put money in to build something else where they can still have the Negroes come with better seats, but still separate from the white people. And that was the great dilemma in the church, how they would do that. And he was saying, you don't have to do that. He says, well, I'm not even saying the Negroes could sit where the white people do, because they were afraid that if the seats were just open to anybody, a white person might sit somewhere where a black person was sitting. And so therefore that would cause a problem. So he said, well, you can just assign some of the open seats and just call them Negro. They didn't want to do that either, so they went back and forth with this whole process. And what I'm saying is, this is oftentimes the way life has gone, that people have their prejudices, but they're trying to act as though they don't. It's like coming into the church where one person is dressed in poor raiment, another person comes in with a lot of rich clothing. I think it's good to live in environments where you're living in big contrast, because you get accustomed to it as opposed to seeing it for the first time, and then it brings things out in your heart you didn't know were there. And this is oftentimes why racism is such a hard issue, because when you're challenged to deal with people equally that for history's sake you haven't really been used to, it becomes challenging more than you think, because when you're not dealing with them on an equal basis, you don't have to think about it. But now you have to think about it, and it poses challenges, not just to them, but to you. And so when James brings that up, he's saying there's the problem there. In our hearts, we have problems. And when we don't face those problems, we go along as if we don't have them. But we have them all the time. And whenever we're faced with it, they come up. But we don't consider ourselves the problem. We try to find a solution to the problem by not dealing in the right way with the problem. And life is too short for that. That's why you can never harvest. By the time you get to your solution, the harvest would have long been over. And by the way, you may not have made it either. So this is why it is. The harvest is urgent. It's timely. You have to do it when it's there. You have to work full out. Everybody's got to work. Everybody's got to work hard, because that's the way you get all of your harvest. It's a timing thing. It's an effort thing. But the harvest is also in places that people's hearts are not. The harvest is also in places where people are not looking because they don't want to look there, because it's too challenging for them. But you lose your position to be part of the harvest. And if you lose your position to be part of the harvest, you lose your position to be part of the wage earner. This is why this is all so significant. Jesus' point was not just that I touched the heart of Samaritans. His point also was you never would have gone there. And all you had to do was lift up your eyes, and you would have seen there's a harvest if you were willing to go there. That's why we have little time. That's why you have to have your heart right. And that's why you got to be laborious. The labor is in both. It's knowing God's will, and it's being prepped to do it. Sometimes we know it, but we're not prepped to do it. Sometimes we're prepped to do it, and we don't know it, which hinders your ability to do it right. But when you find somebody that can see it and know it, put them in the game. We got a plan. We want to take this thing. Give me a LeBron. Give me somebody in there that can read the floor. They can see the floor just like you're looking at it from the TV set. They're down there, but they can still see the overview. They know the game so well. They're able to see what the average person doesn't see. Floyd Mayweather, one of the great things about him is he would sit there and box, and sometimes he'd be right there in front of you, and boxers will say, you can't hit him. He's right there in front of you, and he keeps slipping everything you throw. He knew how to read them. He could read what they're going to do as they're doing it. And he could be right in front of your face and slip what you're doing. You got to be a laborer in God's kingdom. Let's pray. Most holy and almighty Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for your spirit. We thank you for this fellowship. We thank you for your heart. We thank you for your word. We thank you, Lord, that we're not alone. But you said you'd never leave nor forsake us. If you're with us, who can be against us? But Lord, in you being with us indicates we have to be with you. So make our hearts right. Keep us focused in the right way so we can get in a full harvest. So we can be supportive, so we can be laborious, and so we can be very intentional and be free to do it without going through all of these issues, because our hearts really are not where they need to be. So get us right, make us right, whatever it takes, in order that we are able to more effectively and efficiently reach the kingdom. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen and amen. Let us stand. The doors of the church are open.
Jesus, keep me shed its beams around me. In the cross, in the cross, leave my glory ever, till my raptured soul shall find rest beyond the river.
Amen. Done as the Lord's commanded, and yet there's still room. Amen. Next Saturday, we will have our men's fellowship at 7 a.m.